grace, how sweet the sound. 我罪已得赦免。
Fui ciego, mas hoy miro yo.
Perdutor salvo soy.
So much has changed in our world lately.
疫情中这么多人失去生命，显明了生命的脆弱与短暂。
Pero la asombrosa gracia y amor de Jesús es más fuerte que la vida y la muerte.
Wo auch immer du bist, ruf seinen Namen an. Jesus.
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 Isa Masi. Jesucristo.
Yeshua. Jesus.
Don't wait another day.
Thank you, Louis. I found that very moving. Everybody has a heart, and everybody needs the love of Jesus. All right, Gordon, over to you.
Thank you for that delightful music. In the 3 times I'm with you, I've been drawing on my own experience in COVID and my own personal experience as a missionary and a teacher of missions, and my experience in Africa that includes Helderberg. The best person I met at Helderberg was the one I married. I met her when she was 16 and I was 16. And so here she came up. She came with me to greet you. There you go. There you go.
Hello.
This is Cheryl Brown. Here's Gary. You see Gary's picture. He studied with your daddy. And a lot of these people have some connection to you in some way.
Hello.
So she's a professor in her own right. Sometime get her and she'll give you a weekend series or buy her own. She says no.
You're not a preacher.
She says she's not a preacher, but it's not true.
Only at my husband.
She only preaches at her husband.
We'll leave you to do some talking to her over the next week or two. All right, Gordon. You've muted yourself.
I mute. All right. You hear me now? Okay. Here we go. It strikes me that when thinking about the COVID pandemic that we're facing, that what Jesus did and taught and how he treated lepers was something that was really valuable for us to consider. And there was that wonderful story in Matthew 8 where Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man and said, "I am willing, be clean." And immediately he was cleansed of his leprosy. So some of this is a bit of a repeat from a few slides. As you know, Cheryl and I lived and worked in Malawi a long time. And for those who maybe weren't here for the other meeting, just to review the history of Adventist Christianity and Adventists in Malawi. Livingston came in 1859. The first Anglicans came in 1861. George James, the first Adventist independent missionary in 1893. Adventists purchased Plainfield Mission from the Seventh-day Baptist in 1902. Thomas Branch and his family, who were African Americans, came and with Joseph Booth became the first official missionaries. And the mission was renamed Malamulo. By 1905, 7 young boys were baptized. And notice how the population of Malawi has grown in little over 100 years from about 1 million to 17 million. Tremendous mission challenge, but also a wonderful case story of mission success, as now there are over 500,000 members, Adventist members in the country of Malawi. Here are the branches who were the first missionaries at Malamulo. The first church at Malamulo Mission, and the second church, the big church that was built there. It was renovated over the years, and this is what you would see if you went to Malamulo to worship today. One of the prominent features of mission in Malawi from the very beginning was the medical work. In 1915, a South African by the name of Irene Fourie came as the first nurse to start a clinic. In 1925, Carl Birkenstock was the first physician. In 1926, specialized care was started for leprosy patients because it was such an obvious need in that country. In the 1950s, my mother, Florence, worked in rural dispensaries, and when Cheryl and I first went to Malawi in the 70s as adults, her first job was to supervise 6 rural dispensaries. We did it together, going out, taking our circuits through the northern region of Malawi to 6 dispensaries, delivering medicine and supervising. Today, there are hospitals, rural clinics, and dental clinics, and I think optometry. The Adventist University of Malawi has a campus at Malamulo that trains about 30% of Malawi's healthcare workers. 30%, about maybe a little under a third of every healthcare worker in Malawi is trained by Adventists at Malamulo. It's a phenomenal contribution that the church is making to healthcare in that country. And the most recently, Loma Linda University began a collaboration with Malamulo to bring in physicians who had been trained in Africa to give them surgical residencies at Malamulo. So the professors come from Loma Linda University to work with professors at Malamulo to train residents. This is what the hospital looks like today. There's much more to it behind. We can't see the whole picture, but this is the main entrance to the hospital. And some of the physicians, some of the professors, and some of the surgical residents there at the front entrance of the hospital today. So I did a little research on treatment of leprosy in Malawi on Google, and I found this from 1928, report from the colonial government about a hospital for lepers at Malamulo in Nyasaland, 1928. We are treating 105 patients now. We discharged 11 patients this month. So far, as we know, they are free from infection. I ordered them to report every 3 months for examination. You'll be interested to know that Malamulo, that Malamulo SDA Mission Leper Colony recently discharged 11 more patients who have been pronounced cured. This makes a total of about 25 who have been discharged from this colony since it began to operate. I think that it is a fairly good record considering the obstinacy of this disease. So Adventist Mission was one of the leading providers of treatment, specialized treatment for leprosy. Here are some early pictures of the leper colony at Malamulo. They were brought there from the villages where they lived. They were given very simple homes, very much like what they had back home in their villages. But this is a place where they could live without stigma and without criticism. They provided a living stipend, and a chapel was built there for regular church services. I think that may be Nurse Faree, if I'm not mistaken, the one who started working so early at Malamulo Mission. More pictures of the leper colony. On the front page of the Adventist Review, the Review and Herald, in 1939, a view of the Malamulo leper colony, Malamulo Mission, Nyasaland, Africa. And in 1957, Dr. Jack Harvey from South Africa discharges Ruth Kafere, who had been a patient for 30 years. My, she must have had a very obstinate case, but he was able to give her a certificate that she was free of leprosy at that point. Some of you may know Dr. Harvey or know of him, did an amazing work there. And I played with his children when I was a child growing up in Malawi. There was the Trans-Africa Leprosy Rehabilitation and Research Program that was started by the division in a number of locations. So here are some fascinating numbers. In 1975, there were about 10 million lepers globally, 4 million of which were in Africa. By 1980, the number was down to 5 million. And by 2016, according to WHO figures, the number was down to just over 250,000 in the world. The reason was the early diagnosis and effective, inexpensive drugs that cut the numbers dramatically. One of the people who worked with Talraz when we were in Malawi was David and Wendy Statler. They worked on the Lower Shiri doing this work. Talraz served 6 nations. Dr. Ray Foster, an American who had grown up in Zambia, was the director, and he had an aircraft that with which he visited 11 hospitals performing reconstructive surgery on leprosy patients. Eventually, the colonies were replaced by outpatient treatment, and sometime in the early 70s, I wasn't able to find the date, that leper colony at Malamulo and the one at Mwami in Zambia was closed because it simply wasn't needed. The treatment was taken to them and they were cured. They could stay at home with their family members. Here is a rather poor picture of Dr. Foster's plane and a newspaper, an Adventist Review article reporting on the work that was being done among leprosy patients. If there was progress in treating leprosy in modern times, that certainly wasn't the case in the past. Archaeologists have found evidences of leprosy as far back as 3000 BC. It was considered the most terrible of all diseases. It afflicted old and young, male and female, rich and poor, lower and upper classes, slaves and slave owners. It could get anybody. It could attack every part of the body and destroy the mind. It was a kind of terrible progressive death in which a man dies by inches. Josephus said lepers were treated as if they were in fact already dead men. Naaman is an example, an Old Testament example of somebody and the extreme measures that he took as a leprosy patient to try to get treatment. Well, the Old Testament, the law of Moses addressed leprosy. It's interesting if you read in Leviticus 13, detailed diagnostic procedures that were outlined by Moses, specific periods of observation, and the color and the spread of the lesion was to be studied in detail. So here's a sample, 3 verses from Leviticus 13. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, when a person has on the skin of his body a swelling or an eruption or a spot, and it turns into a case of leprous disease on the skin of his body, then he shall be brought to Aaron, to the priest, or to one of his sons of the priests, and the priest shall examine the diseased area on the skin of his body. And if you would read the rest of the chapter, you would find the detailed instructions on how the priest should respond to the leprosy patients when they came. There were detailed instructions for cleansing. The leprous person who has a disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry out, unclean, unclean. He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall live alone. His dwelling shall be outside the camp, outside the community. Unclean, unclean, the person would be calling. Well, in ancient times, multiple skin diseases were included under the title of leprosy. They didn't have the modern knowledge that we have. The modern term is Hansen's disease. It involves the loss of nerve impulses and unconscious self-injury and the loss of body parts. For example, a woman who starts to get leprosy loses the sensation in her fingers, and when she cooks food over a fire, she puts her hand in the fire and doesn't feel a thing. And bit by bit, her hand is burnt by the fire, or she injures it, or maybe a man who's hammering, a carpenter is using a hammer, hammers his thumb and he doesn't even know that he's hammered his thumb. And so gradually the parts of the body are lost. The Mosaic laws had a dual function: to promote public health in a pre-modern scientific era, and to safeguard ritual purity under the ceremonial law and the sanctuary system. So what does Hansen's disease look like? You've probably seen it, but if you have difficulty looking at troubling pictures, the next slide is a troubling one. And let me prepare you. These are some of the victims of modern leprosy and what they look like today. It's wonderful that there are many less people who look like this, because treatment is given and the cure is given so early, much earlier in the disease process. As a child, I remember visiting the leper colonies at Malamulo and Mwami so frequently and seeing people who looked like that. I remember being at Mwami Hospital in Zambia with my parents, and I remember Dad mentioning, he said, you know, it feels odd to shake hands with people at the door and to find out that the person has no fingers that you're shaking hands with. Well, they actually weren't that fearful, because the doctors had told them that as long as one washes one's hands carefully and maintains good hygiene, that there isn't all that much danger of contracting leprosy. But I can tell you, when Dad came back from camp meeting and shaking hands with the lepers, he always washed his hands very, very carefully, because it's something that makes one fearful. Well, leprosy was something that concerned Jesus Christ in his ministry. He was a healer who healed lepers. Matthew chapter 4 says, and he went throughout all of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every affliction among the people. Healing people of leprosy was a regular part of his work. Several passages tell us that lepers were cleansed. There are specific cases of lepers being cleansed. There's Simon the leper. There are the 10 lepers who stood at a distance. And there is the leper who came to Jesus after the Sermon on the Mount. And that's the one that we will focus more attention on this evening. The Sermon on the Mount took place at a beautiful location. These are some artistic renditions of approximations of what it must have looked like. And this is the modern place, the Mount of Beatitudes, where the sermon was thought to have been preached. A few years ago, I was there with Cheryl and our 2 children. I remember sitting on one of those slopes and reading the Beatitudes. And so picture, if you will, Jesus coming down off of that mountain. He's been there with thousands of people who have been crowding around for to hear every word that he spoke. And it said that when he came down from the mountain, large crowds followed him. And a leper came to him and bowed before him. Just bear in mind, he wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be far away, covering his face, holding his hand in front of his mouth, crying, unclean, unclean, unclean. But here comes the leper, bowing down before him. And this leper said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. If you are willing, you can make me clean. Who ever heard of such a thing? That a leper could be clean. It was unknown in ancient times. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him. Now, William Barclay, in his commentary, says that to a Jew, there would be no more amazing sentence in the New Testament than the simple statement, and Jesus put forth his hand and touched the leper. Well, my father put forth his hand and shook the hands of lepers when he lived in Malawi. But this is a different story. In modern times, leprosy was understood, and the physicians had told my dad, from their experience and their expert knowledge, that leper patients could be treated as part of the community. They could be shown love. They could be included by shaking their hands after the service. And so it was not an amazing thing for my father to put forth his hand. For a Jew in Christ's time to put forth his hand and touch the leper was a very, very amazing thing that would have caused people to be shocked. Remember, Jesus was that kind of person. He was that kind of person who would meet with sinners and harlots and with the outcasts. And he would even reach forth his hand and touch the leper. And when Jesus touched him, he said, I am willing, be cleansed. And immediately, the leprosy was cleansed. Immediately, leprosy was cleansed. Whether that meant that hands came back that had disappeared, or whether it just meant that all of the sickness and the dead flesh and the dirty flesh was gone, unclean flesh, so the healthy and strong, I don't know. But it said that his leprosy was cleansed. So the word cleanse comes from the Greek katharizo. It means to make clean. To cleanse has several meanings. It means to cleanse from physical stains and dirt, such as utensils or food. To cleanse a leper, to cleanse by curing, to remove by cleansing. It also has a moral sense, and to free from the defilement of sin and from faults, to purify from wickedness, to free from the guilt of sin, to purify, to consecrate by loving and purifying, to consecrate, to dedicate, or it means to pronounce clean in the Levitical ritual sense. And when Jesus healed the leper, it happened in all these ways. In all these ways. There's no evidence or statement that he was a man of any particular moral sin more than anybody else. But that was part of the cleansing. And his body was cleansed in a physical sense. And he was ritually clean so that when he visited the priests, he was allowed to go into the temple to participate in the rituals there. Let's think about the dimensions of Christ's cleansing. It was intensely personal, not from a distance, but personal. I don't know about you, but I like it when I go to the doctor that he puts his hand on me. A week or two ago, I had my annual physical. And my family physician, the one whose life was spared of COVID so dramatically that I told you about, he took me into his office and he touched me on my back, on my chest, he looked for different things that he had to check out. And it was a personal encounter between a physician and the patient. And that's how Jesus was. He was intensely personal when he healed a person. It was physical healing for sure. The exact nature and the extent of the man's ailment is not clear. It was probably Hansen's disease. Was he missing fingers, hands, toes, or feet? We don't know, but he was healed nonetheless. It was moral, ethical cleansing from sin. The sins are not specified, but without doubt, the man felt left, when he left the presence of Jesus Christ, he felt that his inward nature, his spiritual, moral, ethical self had been cleansed and healed by the touch of Jesus Christ. And it was the ceremonial ritual cleansing where he had access now to the temple. It was social ritual healing because his relationship with his family and his community could be restored. Did he have a wife or parents that were living or siblings? We don't know. Children? We don't know. But whatever his social relations were, he was able to be restored to them because of Christ's healing. So I see some major lessons for us as we think about leprosy. One is the extreme seriousness of sin. Leprosy is a fantastic and an excellent symbol of sin. COVID is also a tremendous symbol of sin. It's not something to mess around with or to play games with. It is something that affects our not only our life here, but it affects our eternal destiny. It affects everyone else. My sin affects the life of my family members. And it's not something to be taken lightly. It's something to come to Jesus with, to have healing with from, so that our lives may be purified in every way. The second lesson is the extreme power of God to cleanse the sinner. Christ's cleansing of the leper illustrates what he does for our sinfulness. Hebrews 7 says that Jesus is able to save to the uttermost those who draw near to God through him, since he always lives to make intercession for them. He is living today. He is working today. He is our intercessor in the heavenly courts, and he will save us to the uttermost. He has absolute power to cleanse, to forgive us for every single sin that we have ever committed in our entire life. Desire of Ages, page 266. The work of Christ in cleansing the leper from his terrible disease is an illustration of his work in cleansing the soul from sin. The man who came to Jesus was full of leprosy. Its deadly poison permeated his whole body. The disciples sought to prevent their master from touching him, for he who touched the leper became himself unclean. But in laying his hand upon the leper, Jesus received no defilement. His touch imparted life-giving power. The leprosy was cleansed. Thus it is with the leprosy of sin, deep-rooted, deadly, impossible to be cleansed by human power. The whole head is sick, the whole heart is faint. From the sole to the foot, even unto the head, there is no soundness in it, but wounds and bruises and putrefying sores. But Jesus, coming to deal in humanity, receives no pollution. His presence was a healing virtue for the sinner. The third lesson has to do with sowing and reaping. Now, Galatians 6:7 does teach us, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever one sows, that he also reaps. This is true. The things that we do usually come back to us, to haunt us. But sickness or health, poverty or prosperity are not direct and carefully calibrated results of good deeds and bad deeds. I mentioned this concept this morning. It's not that we get precisely what we deserve. It is that these things come upon humanity because of the situation we have in this sinful world. The leper in the story was not necessarily a greater sinner than the others. Morally good people can suffer more than morally wicked people. Think of Job. Sometimes I think that the devil protects his own, because it seems that really wicked people who do horrendous things live on and on and on. They don't get AIDS. They don't get cancer. They don't get COVID. They just keep on and on and on doing the evil things that they do. And maybe the devil has a hand in protecting them. So it is wrong to conclude, I believe, that suffering is caused by hidden sins. Oh, well, we know about you. You got this or that or the other thing. We know you. There's something that you're hiding. If you would just go ahead and confess it, you wouldn't be bothered by that disease anymore. This is not how disease happens. It's not how it is related to sin. Doing good deeds and avoiding evil deeds cannot save a person because human sinfulness extends to the deepest level. There's nothing that we can possibly do that makes us worthy of salvation. It is indeed a gift of grace. The fourth lesson, not all suffering is caused by curses and evil spirits. But if it is, God can rescue, heal, and save the sufferer. Malawi is a place where people are often, they often think about curses that are placed upon them. And those evil spirits are very real. They're very real indeed. The text doesn't suggest that the leper was cursed by other people. But indeed, Christ does have power over evil powers. And there's a story in the Bible of his casting out the demons and sending them into the hogs. Evil powers are indeed very real. Ephesians 6:12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places. We are living in a fallen world, in a time of when spiritual warfare is something that is a reality for Christians. And if we suffer from that, then God can relieve us of that. And we should come to him, and he will free us from that power, just as he freed people who were demon possessed in the time of that he was ministering. The fifth lesson, the nature of true faith. Now, there's a story right after this, and this is the story of the centurion. And that story teaches the very same lesson. That faith is simple. It's like the faith of a small child asking for a banana. Cheryl and I are blessed with 4 beautiful grandchildren. They're getting big now, but I can easily remember them when they were really small, eating breakfast at our table, saying, "Grandma, can I have a banana?" Now, did the child ever doubt that Grandma's going to give him a banana? Not for a minute. He knows if there's bananas in the house, and if he wants to eat a banana for breakfast, he'll have a banana. That's how simple faith really is. Faith is not a matter of beautiful prayers and precious spiritual and precise spiritual formulae that are recited in an exact order. It is not trying to hype ourselves up in some kind of fever pitch of emotions, so that if I feel emotional enough that God is going to save, God will heal, 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 that maybe he will. If I'm emotional enough, then maybe he'll be convinced that he's going to heal me. No, this is not the biblical picture of faith that we see in the story of the leper or in the story of the centurion. Rather, faith is submissive. It's not manipulative. It's not saying, God, you promised, we have claimed, now you must do what you promised. No. Faith is not trying to add conviction upon conviction until God is somehow then obligated to do what we ask. I'm so convicted, I feel so emotional, God, you have to do what I've asked you to do. No, this is manipulative. This is not what it's like to be to have the faith of the little child that Jesus recommended. Faith and obedience do not place an obligation upon God that makes him have to do what we ask him to do. And so, general conclusions before I say something specifically about COVID. God heals physical ailments, whether through modern medicine or direct miracles. See, God is the person who made the chemicals that exist in the world. And if researchers and physicians can discover those chemicals, and then they can give them to us in the right way, then it is still God's power that is healing us. It is the chemicals in medicines like dapsone that are given to lepers that heal the leper through God's power, and the power of research and knowledge and science that helps us know what chemicals will heal is no less from God than is the miracle, the spectacular miracle that we read about, that Jesus, when he reached out his hand and said, "Be clean." God here heals spiritual elements through the Word and the Holy Spirit. And indeed, we do suffer spiritual ailments today. God heals social, relational problems. These are real. We encounter them in our lives. We have them in the church. God can heal those. Adventist World Mission continues to bring Christ's healing touch to spiritual, social, material, and physical needs of all kind. And in conclusion, just a couple of lessons that are related to what I've said already, but are mentioned with COVID in mind. People in biblical times had a pre-scientific knowledge that didn't include viruses. They didn't know what they were. But you know, these viruses, this COVID, without question, is a work of the devil against God's creatures. It's not an act of God. God didn't cause that virus to come out of the bat in China or wherever it came from. He didn't make it go, like sicking the dog, saying, "Dog, sick him, sicking the dog." He didn't want that virus to go out upon humanity. This is the devil's work. This is not something that God does. COVID is a globalized natural disaster. We often speak of those. It's not an act of God. It's globalized. We have earthquakes, floods, and hurricanes that are localized. Thank the Lord, the whole world doesn't have the same earthquake at the same time. It happens in different places. But what's bad about COVID is that it's globalized, and much of the whole earth is suffering from it right now. And believers are subject to COVID along with all of humanity. So, like a flood or like an earthquake, God doesn't send a helicopter to lift every believer out of an earthquake. This is something that believers suffer along with unbelievers in this evil, sinful world that is upset by the devil. And some believers never get COVID. Some have mild cases. Some have serious cases, and some die of COVID. One's response to COVID is not a barometer of faith, spirituality, or their standing before God. As I told you, my case was relatively mild. Cheryl's case was a little more serious, and our doctor's case was really serious. It doesn't mean that he was a worse person than Cheryl and me. It has not a barometer of faith, spirituality, or standing before God. I'm grateful that survivors can learn valuable spiritual lessons. We can grow through the illness. I think I've grown. It was a fearful journey that we went through, but I'm grateful for some spiritual lessons that I learned. And then believers have a moral, spiritual obligation to protect themselves and others as much as we can. In Old Testament times, when cures from leprosy were simply not available, the law of Moses said that lepers needed to isolate themselves. And in this age, when we don't have a vaccine or a cure from the virus, then the same principles from the book of Leviticus apply to us. We as believers have an obligation to isolate ourselves from other people if we are in danger of giving it to them. And maybe what sums it all up is the golden rule when Jesus said, "So in everything do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets." So I would prefer, very much prefer, that the person who gave Cheryl and me the virus would have isolated themselves. That would have been nice. Maybe they didn't even know they had it. I don't know who it was. I'm not blaming them. I don't have a feeling of bitterness to them. But if they had known it, and if they were able to isolate themselves, they had an obligation to do so. And Cheryl and I have taken our obligation to do that very, very seriously. Until now, we're starting to feel better. So, my friends, these are some of my reflections and my thoughts on COVID and how we should live as Christians. I pray that God will bless us all, that we will navigate through this pandemic as people of true faith.